Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual coffee hour for December. Today we have Benjamin Case. Dr. Benjamin Case will present on his recently published book. And the title of his presentation is The Complex Dynamics of Violence and Nonviolence in Protests. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. Please go ahead.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. So this book is the product of about 8 years of research and writing, but the questions that led to the book go back much further. So I always like to say up front that I come from an organizing background and I'm continue to be very involved in organizing movements. And the warrant for the research emerged directly from my experience in Occupy Wall Street and related movements, where the questions of violence and nonviolence were among the most contentious intra-movement debates. So in the book, I'm diving into the messiness in these terms, violence and nonviolence, focusing on collective actions that get labeled riots. For scholars, riots often get loosely grouped together with other forms of more extreme political violence, like warfare and terrorism, on the basis of the use of violence. But on just about any other basis, riots are more productively examined alongside protests and labor strikes and other forms of civil resistance, as opposed to martial resistance. And there's been a couple of reasons that type of examination has been difficult. First, many sociological approaches to movements have come to focus on formal organizations and processes. And second, and more importantly for this discussion, the rise of strategic nonviolence as a dominant framework in understanding civil uprisings, which insulates instances of nonviolent protest from everything else and makes protests synonymous with nonviolence. And when I say strategic nonviolence, I'm referring to a specific argument. And for many people, I think just an understanding that nonviolent protest tactics are the most effective tools for movements from below. So whereas previous generations of activists argued more about the morality of using violence, the strategic nonviolence argument shifts the conversation to efficacy, where nonviolent approaches to social change aren't better because they're more righteous. They're better because they're more likely to win. So the conversation shifts from arguing that nonviolence makes better people to arguing that nonviolence is a more effective method of political conflict. And the type of event that I saw as a primary driver of the violence-nonviolence debate on the ground was riots, by which I mean basically unarmed violent protest. Obviously, armed there's a spectrum, just like with violence and nonviolence. These terms are fraught and complicated, but for simplicity's sake, I'm calling armed the use of weapons that roughly approximate those used by state forces. So in this case, firearms or bombs. So, someone throwing a rock at a line of armed police, I'm calling that unarmed but violent. And there's lots of other reasons that the term riot is fraught that we can talk about in the discussion if folks want. But, riots are familiar events, right? We know them when we see them. And this is the reason they're often deployed, for example, in popular fiction as narrative mechanisms to convey chaos and disorder and popular dissent. And in fact, riots all over the world demonstrate remarkably similar repertoires of action. There's repeated behaviors and rituals that are easily recognizable that go along with riots, like throwing cold projectiles, burning vehicles, breaking windows, and damaging buildings associated with political enemies, building street barricades, and so forth. So we see this shift in the way that this debate's happening, right? Whereas in the 1960s, a global uprising era saw intra-movement debates about violence and nonviolence. They were on the one hand more about morality, but on the other hand, they were focusing on guerrilla tactics and armed struggle. Whereas in the 21st century moment, we see these debates over violence and nonviolence more about efficacy and also more focused on rioting and unarmed violent action, on urban protests that occupy this gray area between what we might be comfortable calling violent or nonviolent, on a category of action that I'm calling street rebellion. So the book tries to tackle street rebellion by first critiquing the primary framework that I see as holding us back from accurately assessing this phenomenon, namely strategic nonviolence, but also by trying to move beyond the violence-nonviolence debate as such and examining riotous actions on their own terms in conjunction with other similar types of movement actions in civil uprisings. So the first part of the book theoretically and empirically deconstructs the argument for strategic nonviolence. And for the theory aspect, I focus on Gene Sharp, who was a scholar at Oxford and then Harvard, whose theory of strategic nonviolence in the 1970s became formative for the field of study and practice that came to be known as nonviolent direct action or civil resistance. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here, but happy to circle back in Q&A. But the most important point for this discussion is the mechanism by which nonviolence is supposed to make movements more effective, and that's mass mobilization. So the argument basically goes that movements need numbers of people to win, right? The state or major corporations or whatever, they have a lot of resources at their disposal. The state has a monopoly on legitimate violence. They have guns. They have more access to propaganda tools. Right? Big corporations have access to money. But movements from below, their main source of leverage is numbers of people. And the argument is that nonviolence helps bring mass numbers of people to the streets, whereas violent actions demobilize people. They make movements smaller, and that's why they make them less effective. That's the basic operating mechanism in the argument. And this is, from bird's eye view, this is compelling in many ways. But the argument also relies on selective telling of history. Where almost every single case, using Gene Sharp, but you can update it till today, almost every single historical case that Sharp uses in reality involved many actions that were not nonviolent by his own terms. And to make this argument, you have to sort of box the nonviolent tactics out from these other tactics that were often involved in the same movements. And it turns out that the empirical argument for nonviolence, for strategic nonviolence, has very similar problems. So in the book, I focus on Erica Chenoweth's research with the Nonviolent and Violent Conflicts and Outcomes dataset, or NAVCO, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The source of Chenoweth's most prominent contribution, the 2011 book, Why Civil Resistance Works, co-authored with Maria Stephan. And in that book, Chenoweth and Stephan attempt to empirically validate basically the same strategic nonviolence argument. And just like the more theoretical argument, the primary mechanism for Chenoweth and Stephan for movement success is identified as mass numbers of people in the streets on a consistent basis. And nonviolence is supposed to help facilitate that. So they examine and compare the outcomes of primarily violent and primarily nonviolent campaigns, maximalist campaigns to overthrow the state, over the course of 20th century and into the 21st century. And they find that the primarily nonviolent campaigns are about twice as likely to succeed as violent campaigns. And the sort of headline takeaway is that nonviolence is more effective. So among many problems with this research, I focus on the fact that Chenoweth and Stephan are comparing these two categories. The primarily violent category is composed of wars, of interstate conflict, civil war. And they're juxtaposing that with unarmed conflicts, which they're calling primarily nonviolent up front, and then later just calling nonviolent. But there's no variables for riots or any type of violence that falls below the threshold for war in the nonviolent category. And in fact, so the sort of first step I took in this research was interpolating riots into NAVCO by adding a variable from the bank's cross-national time series data archive on riots in. And what we see is that the vast majority of nonviolent campaigns in NAVCO contained major riots. These are not a couple people throwing rocks within an otherwise nonviolent protest. This is major riots that involve more than 100 participants and a serious level of damage. And there's also a lot of reasons that banks is conservative data set. There's probably undercounts riots in a lot of instances. And as I go through and show, case by case, you bring this number up to almost 100% of the nonviolent cases, both successful and not in NAVCO, involved major riots. And the problem is not just terminological, right? This is important because the research, this research in NAVCO gets turned around and used, including by the authors, to explicitly argue that any break from pure nonviolence in protests will hurt a movement's chance for success, when in fact the successful cases in their research are full of violent protests. So my next step is I wanted to test the mechanism itself, right? The real question that strategic nonviolent arguments pivot on is whether or not riots demobilize movements, demobilize otherwise nonviolent protests. So I looked at annual data, again from banks, which has variables for major riots and also for large nonviolent demonstrations. And I looked at this data from 10 countries over 74 years between 1946 and 2020. I looked at Brazil, China, Ethiopia, France, England, Iran, Mexico, Philippines, South Africa, and the US. Trying to get cases that I had reason to believe were reasonably accurate in the data in banks, and also trying to get a dispersion over different geographies and economic systems, political systems, and histories and things like that. And so as you can see, and so I'm going to, ran OLS regressions and time series analysis, but it's also just very easy to see in the graph. So I'm just going to run through the graphs of all these countries, and you'll see that in every instance, riots and nonviolent demonstrations, they tend to spike together. When there's a shock to one variable, there's a shock to both. And so this is you can't see anything in this, but it's in here if we want to circle back. This is just the results of the OLS regressions and the time series, but we can just look at the graphs here. So the darker line is riots and the lighter line is nonviolent demonstrations. This is the US. I'm just going to go through the cases here quickly, but we can come back to all of them. But you can see the common dynamic here. These tend to move together. Sometimes a shock to one is larger than the other, but in almost every instance, they're moving in the same direction. There's few exceptions. And I'll just run through all and sort of let you take a look at these. But we can come back in the discussion if you're interested. Philippines and South Africa. Okay, and then I think I had. Oh, there's the UK. Right, there we go. Okay. And then there's one more in the US that's a mistake. So, okay. So I'll just leave that up for the time being, or let me leave the US up because I'm speaking from the country called the US. Okay. So, I'm happy to talk more about the methodology in the Q&A as well, but I'll just say outright that this is not sufficient to make any claims about the specifics or the size of this effect, right? I'm not saying that riots reliably make movements grow, and I'm certainly not saying that each riot will lead to, an additional 1.2 protests or anything like that. What this methodology is designed to do is, what the takeaways are, two main things. First, that this is evidence that riots do not demobilize movements, broadly speaking. And second, when there's a major moment of uprising, in almost every case, we see both violent protest and nonviolent protest as part of that uprising, right? So in other words, instead of looking at violent protest and nonviolent protest in opposition to one another, we should be looking at them together as co-constitutive of civil uprisings. And part of that has to do with the terminology. And this is another thing we can get back into, but there's shifting bases for whether or not we call something violent or nonviolent, right? And if we're tagged to that line, we're going to have a lot of difficulty comparing cases over time and in different places in terms of what types of actions are taking place. But to investigate further, I turn to qualitative analysis, which I think is important here on a number of levels. Let me just check where I'm at time frame so I don't talk for too long. I think qualitative analysis is important on a number of levels. First, as much as riots are familiar events, their agents are almost entirely silent in the study of social change. In fact, one of the most common elements of discussion of riots from all sides is a flattening of rioters into an externally imposed collective identity, or in many cases, a non-identity, going back to theories of crowd hysteria that were influential in the 19th century that held that riotous crowds destroyed individual subjectivity and grafted onto people some kind of primitive herd mentality, right? These sorts of theories are still very influential today. We can see them all over the place. So for me, this study needed to center the experiences of rioters themselves. And I did this through in-depth interview studies, two case studies, one in the United States with self-described anarchists who had participated in a tactic known as the Black Bloc, which is very commonly associated with willingness to engage in forceful actions with police and property. And then second in South Africa, with student uprisings in 2015 and 16 associated with the hashtag fees must fall, and also associated movements, roads must fall and outsourcing must fall. And along the way, for theoretical guidance, I looked to theories like Durkheim's collective effervescence and Fanon's decolonial violence and Sorel's insurrectionary violence, among others. So I do want to make sure we have ample time for discussion, but I want to go over a few main takeaways from the interview studies, and then read a couple of quotes from the interviewees to give a flavor to these studies. So first, the interviews indicate that riots do contain a particularly heightened type of collective experience, but not one that erases the individual. People described riotous moments in terms that you might expect, like frightening and exciting and adrenaline rush, but also some of the most common descriptors were words like beautiful and magical and even euphoric, but in a deeply politicized way, where participants came away with an embodied sense of material conflict and also radically expanded horizons of political possibility. And second, acts of political violence and protests are often primarily symbolic. And most people I interviewed didn't think the riot was going to make any difference in and of itself, in most instances. Rather, it was a method of communicating dissent in a register that was appropriate to the seriousness of the grievance. The effect of this was often experienced by people and relayed as dignifying and as humanizing. So Hannah Arendt, in her study of violence, once said that the most dehumanizing conditions are the ones in which there's no visible rage in response to oppression. And she was talking about concentration camps. So in this sense, riots are expressing that rage and reclaiming a shared humanity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. So like in the book, I say that the old adage that violence never solves anything isn't necessarily wrong for protests. The violence of the riot isn't really meant to solve the problem. It's meant to clarify the problem for onlookers, but also for participants themselves. And this is important because it distinguishes these experiences both from ideas of strategic nonviolence and also from instrumental arguments of political violence as simply a means to an end. Right? The affective, symbolic, and communicative elements of riots are essential to understanding them and their impacts on political conflict. All right, so I just want to share a few quotes directly to bring the voices of some of the folks I spoke to directly into this. The first is from someone called Z. I used pseudonyms based on just a spelling out of letters in the Roman alphabet. This person is a white woman in her 50s speaking of an Earth Day action in 1990, where she was part of a group that began to fight with the police. So she says, it felt cohesive, which I guess I had never really felt before. When I had gone to protest before, it was usually with one friend of mine, and it was just us standing around feeling alienated, This was like we're all in a group and the adrenaline is going. It felt like we were one cohesive unit, all moving together, but all doing our own things. And then speaking of that same day, here she references an unarrest, which is a term for when protesters will physically fight somebody out of police custody. So they've been arrested and then they sort of attack that group and get the person out. So she says, I felt really empowered being part of a group like that. And that was a feeling I wanted people to know was possible. And the unarrest, that we didn't have to go along with the power over us, that we could physically remove ourselves from that kind of power and control. I felt just a fundamental shift in my capitulation to authority. And, I was in kind of an abusive relationship at the time, and that day was the end of my tolerance of that. It just felt like it just seemed like a lot more was possible. And so, here we see someone who's directly connecting this, not just to political possibilities, but to her own interpersonal relationships in terms of the horizon of what's possible. And then this is another person, also a white woman. This is in her 30s. She's speaking of a racial justice action in the first wave of the Black Lives Matter uprising, about protests where they occupied a bridge and then it became a fight with police. It was absolutely terrifying, but it also had that feeling, once you crack open that understanding of, am I allowed to do this and that? Once a fissure opens in that, there's a whole other range of possibilities before you. And it's so beautiful. It's thrilling. Like, oh my God, the world is so much more interesting and there's so much more to be done. Right. So, really rich engagement with the political possibilities of just simple actions like again, throwing something or just physically pushing and shoving with police. We're talking about really the minimal. If you were to put political violence on a spectrum, this is really extremely minimal in terms of the type of force, but really having an impact on the way people are seeing themselves and seeing political conflict. So the next person calling S is a Black woman in her 30s. She was a graduate student at University of Johannesburg, speaking about a protest event in the first wave of the Fallist movement when they were marching and police attacked the march. And then some protesters responded by setting some things on fire and throwing rocks. So she says, the police start firing rubber bullets at us. People have been shot in the back. They're laying there and people are hiding out. The cops are walking around with their guns like a war zone, and it's so intense, and we're so broken. It feels like there's no hope. So at that point, a bus shelter was burnt, and we all thought it was beautiful to see the fire, because it's what Fanon mentions. It's kind of like a therapy for us. We needed it in that moment. We needed the roads to be blocked, and we needed the stones. So in this case, really more focusing on the feeling of fighting back in a material way, even if it was, again, minimal, just sort of reclaiming some humanity in that moment. And this is that same person speaking about the same event here later. It gave me energy. It was necessary. We needed that because they're treating us like animals, like people without rights, like non-beings. And I think when we throw stones, it's a way of reclaiming our humanity again, to say we also have some form of agency in the fight. It gave me courage to see that. So for the sake of time, there's another, we can go over more, but I'll skip over this one. But just to wrap up briefly, why does all this matter? The violence-nonviolence binary is creating a number of problems for us. It's creating an analytic problem that hurts our understanding of protest movements. And I think moving beyond this language as primary framing tools as a primary tool for assessing movements helps us better understand civil uprisings as they occur, as well as to research them historically. It also helps inoculate us against the normative claims that get smuggled into these terms. And for just one example, the George Floyd uprising was happening when I was finishing writing the book. So it's in here in terms of my experiences as a participant, but not as much in terms of the interviews. In that moment, there's these media sources and right-wing pundits who are rushing to demonize the protests as pure violence and pure chaos. And critics were obviously correct that this characterization was highly racialized and largely untrue. But as a counter, a lot of people rushed to claim the opposite, right? That these were fundamentally nonviolent events and arguing or assuming that the violence when it occurred was the work of outside agitators or provocateurs. And the response might have been well-intentioned, but by accepting these categories of violent and nonviolent, we're also implicitly accepting the normative claims that come with them. We're agreeing to shift the focus from why these things are happening to how they're happening. And the words are doing ideological work there by shifting the focus from the source of the grievance to the approach of the aggrieved. So by reacting to the characterization of protest as violent by saying, no, they're nonviolent, we're cornering ourselves into misrecognizing what was actually happening, which is at best leads to misunderstandings of the forces that animate the uprising. But also at worst, it creates a situation where the goal became not to understand the movement on its own terms, but to prove a preconceived conclusion that the protests were nonviolent, because it felt like there was a political importance to doing that. So ultimately, I'm critiquing the language of strategic nonviolence, but I'm not trying to replicate the same problem by inverting it and saying, no, violence is the answer. No, I'm saying this language isn't doing a good job of capturing the most salient aspects of social movement contention. And the analytic and applied toolkits, but by the way, the toolkits that have been built by nonviolence theorists and practitioners have all kinds of positive effects on the study and practice of movement. So it's certainly not to negate that. And also both these words are still important. I'm not trying to jettison the words. In fact, I am arguing that there's material and affective differences between protests that are avowedly nonviolent and those that aren't. but as a binary, as two categories that are mutually exclusive and inherently opposed. The violence versus nonviolence framework is hurting more than it's helping. And then finally, riots are among the oldest and most iconic forms of collective resistance from below, and we can learn a lot about processes of social change by examining the dynamics of riots and the experiences of rioters and incorporating them into the analytic frameworks that we use to understand political conflict. Okay, I will wrap up there. Let me stop sharing the screen. Hi, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for this very interesting talk. I will stop the recording now before we move on to the Q&A.